Thank you for joining Happy Hour with Dr. Lisa. I am your host, the fabulous, may I add, Dr. Lisa Liggins Chambers. So glad you are joining me today. I could not wait once again to get to this podcast to talk to all of you about how I grew up in psychology. But before we get into the blog, you have to read it. In order to do so, you need to go to my website. That website is Lisa, Lisa, Liggins, Liggins, Chambers, CHAMBERS.com. If you have questions, comments, concerns, you can always reach me via phone. That number is 765 205 1959. You may also email me at kidscanseeghosts@gmail.com. So glad to see you guys and talk to you. So I have a lot to talk about today. Today's podcast is dedicated to Chicago. Woohoo! Yay! I love Chicago. Drum roll, please. Chicago is one of my favorite cities in the United States, and I had the pleasure of attending school in Chicago and living there for 8.5 years. So if you can imagine, I have a lot to discuss about the Windy City, including how I grew up in psychology. So I decided to write this blog because I had so many questions coming in about how you go about becoming a psychologist. And I think that's great. That's great. So keep the questions coming in. I actually wrote this blog a couple of months ago on August 28th. So this goes back to August, and we're just now getting to it. So if you haven't read it on the blog, please feel free to do so that you can keep up with these podcasts. So, oh my God, Chicago. So if you've kept up with this blog, then you know that I've had an interesting journey in psychology for many, many years. I'm dating myself now. Over two decades of experience in psychology. And I remember when I was the young one in companies, the young one who had fresh ideas, and not that I don't have fresh ideas now, but definitely didn't have as much experience in the field as I do now. And I remember when so many other people were training me, and now I find myself being the one to train other people, including cross disciplines. So social workers and counselors. So I love working with a lot of other professionals. So it always gives me great pleasure to, help other people, especially in the field of psychology. And now that I've been at least an adjunct professor for quite a while now, I have a lot of experiences to share with you all, which is why I started the blog. So one of the things that I don't talk about too often at all revolve around my experiences with adults. Sorry, guys. I have a heater on and I needed to turn it off because the heater was like 75 degrees and I get hot flashes. So I'm sitting here burning up. So I'm sorry. I had to pause for a minute and turn that heater off. So I've met a lot of different, captivating adults as well. And so some of those adults are also what I call nebulous parents. So I've met many parents who could also see ghosts too, dating back as far as they can remember when they were kids. So, I met a lot of adults in Chicago who actually had, the ability to see ghosts. And I met some adults like that in St. Louis as well. And so I have a lot of different experiences with adults, and I have been trained to work with adults, primarily because obviously you work with adults, when you work with children. And so, being able to take all of those experiences back into schools now gives me great joy. So I say that my experience is starting in Chicago, but that's really with my doctorate degree. My experiences with children actually started in Cleveland. Cleveland, Ohio, that is actually where I was born and raised. So I started working with children back a long time ago, probably 1990. And that experience was with daycare centers. So I used to work in daycare centers. And when I would go home from college and I would get jobs at daycare centers, over the summer, working with different kids. And I remember that I did not have a bad experience working at a daycare center at all. And so it's one of the experiences that I can remember was I was changing a diaper of a little girl and her private areas just look funny to me. Just funny. And it bothered me so badly that when her mother picked her up, I told her mother, I said, when I changed her diaper, her private area just looked really inflamed. It just didn't look normal. And I told her that I had put some, what's that white stuff? Um, Desitin. I put some Desitin on it. If you don't know what Desitin is, it's used for diaper rash. Obviously, I'm not a medical doctor, and I certainly wasn't a medical doctor fresh out of high school. So I told her I wasn't sure if it was diaper rash or not, but just to keep the baby, feeling okay while mom was working, that's what I put on it. And so time went by, and I remember this mom called the daycare center to talk to me. And you know what she told me? She said that she found out that someone had been messing with her baby down there and that the baby actually had an STD. And she did not recognize it, and she was glad that I did. And from that point on, sometimes there are things that have happened to me throughout my career that I remember. And that was literally, I don't even know how to count. That was over 20 years ago. So yeah, that's what happened. So working with kids from that point on, one of the things that I do not like, didn't like then, can't stand now, is that child abuse. So I've always been on a crusade against child abuse. And when I say child abuse, I don't mean spanking your kids. I mean beating the hell out of them, because there's a difference. Abusing them sexually, neglecting them, physically abusing them, emotionally abusing them. And I also don't like it with the elderly as well. So since that time, I knew that I was going to go into psychology and I was going to work with kids, and try to help them get through these devastating things that happen to them. And so I have to say, looking back over the course of almost 30 years, I've accomplished that and I'm still doing it. And so she is a parent that obviously that I've never forgotten about. And obviously that little girl is probably in her 20s by now. Um, I learned about a lot about psychology from then on because I went on to get my bachelor's degree and then in psychology, then a master's degree in school psychology. And so when I went into the master's program, my goal was actually to go into clinical psychology. And I sigh on that. I do. Because I was lazy and didn't change anything, because I was put into school psychology by mistake. I haven't revealed some of that to some of my friends who are listening. They have no clue. But school psychology was actually a mistake. My major was supposed to be clinical psychology. But what happened was I got into all of the testing and found a love for testing, which is different. And when I say testing, I mean psychological testing and educational testing, or what we call psychoeducational testing. And so I started getting really good with understanding statistics and, how stats worked with populations of children and how to read them from different tests. And so I was like, oh, this is pretty fascinating. And because I didn't want to go through with the paperwork to change to clinical psychology, I stuck with school psychology. And that's how I became a school psychologist. And at that time, when I graduated, my advisor, who is named or was named, I'm not sure if he's still alive, Dr. Binkley, I told him I think I wanted to obtain my doctorate in education. And he was against an EDD for me back then, although he had an EDD. And he said, no, I want you, if you get a doctorate degree, I would like for you to get a PhD. And I was like, why? I'm a school psych. What's the difference? If I'll go into administration, then I'll get a doctorate in education. And he said, no, 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 no. You don't understand this now, but you're African American and you need to get a PhD. And I'm like, huh. Okay, well, I guess one day I'll apply for my PhD. That was the first time I was told that. That was the first time. So I went on and I worked and finished up my master's degree. And this was also the time that I worked with individuals with HIV and AIDS. And then I got married and then had a little tiny baby. And decided that I would go ahead and pursue my doctorate. But here's what happened. I thought that I was probably going to go to school in Missouri, which is where I lived when my oldest child was born. That was not God's plan, apparently, because I was accepted to school only in Chicago for my doctorate, believe it or not. So I didn't have a choice but to move to Chicago because I was accepted to multiple schools, which is really unusual, I think, for a PhD. They're not easy to get into. They're not easy to get into. So I felt like I was a great match with Bob, who I talk about on my blog. Bob and I had such a great relationship. He loved the fact that I had that school psych license and that school psych background, and he brought me on into his lab. And there was a cohort of, I think, 12 of us. And so Bob was a child psychologist. And if you keep up with the blogs, I talk about Bob every now and then. And Bob actually passed away about 2 years ago, which devastated me and anyone who knew him. He was just a great man. Taught me everything I know about being a psychologist, a child psychologist, a behaviorist in particular. And so my family and I moved to Chicago. And Chicago became pretty quickly a city that I love. To this day, I love it. When I found out we were moving back to Illinois, I was like, yay! Moving back to Illinois is like moving back home for me. And so I moved to Chicago and pursued my doctorate degree. Now, along the journey in Chicago, it wasn't just about learning in the classroom. It just wasn't. I've had some fascinating experiences, and I also was a new mother. So I started the doctorate program when my daughter was 9 months old. So I was still a nursing mom when I started my doctorate program. So I'm going to stop right there for just a second. There have been some questions that came to me about having a baby, a young baby, and being in a doctorate level program. One of the things that I like to do is to always be honest with people. It was hard as hell to have a new baby and start a doctorate program. And I was the only one with the baby in my cohort initially, right? Someone else had children over time. And so I had to learn a lot pretty quickly about how strong I was as a woman, how to channel that strength, how to be a mother first and still learning in psychology. I had to learn, how to balance things like, my homework, my papers, my exams, my internships, my practicums, my residency requirements, all while having a baby. So if I sit here and tell you that was easy, it was not. It was not. I was very, very blessed because I had a great support system from my mother to my ex-husband to my friends to my cousin, Tina. I just had a whole lot of support. And so I learned how to balance my life. I learned that I need to have a different type of determination to get through that doctorate program. And I had to learn all of this in a brand new city. Chicago, you guys know, is what, the second largest city in the country? Third, New York, LA, Chicago. LA, New York, Chicago, I think is number three. So it was huge, huge. And then I had to adjust to my new baby going into daycare when I would go to my classes. So I'm not going to tell you that it was easy, because it was hard. And the baby also had to adjust to me. So one of the things that I wrote on this blog is happy 21st birthday to the love of my life. And that was dedicated to my new baby. So she turned 21 years this year, which is unbelievable. She used to walk around the lab with her bottles and stuff, and people used to hold her, my classmates and stuff. And sometimes when they see her on social media, they just kind of go, golly, we can't believe she's 21, because they remember when we got our doctorate degrees that she was a little baby. And now she's a senior in college herself. So, enjoy your kids, because they do grow up pretty fast. So once I got through the doctorate program, I worked at a couple of different companies. And so before you get your doctorate, pending what you want to do, I was going into private work. And I don't even know where I came up with the idea of going into private practice. Somehow it shifted from being in the schools to going into private practice. When you go into private practice, you have to have a state board license to do so. So that means that you need to go to an American Psychological Association or APA accredited university. That's number one. A lot of people talk about getting these doctorate degrees online. If they are not APA accredited, I'm going to tell you right now that you will have either a really difficult time getting board approval to take a license, or they will flat out reject you because the school doesn't meet the requirements. Your best bet is to get a doctorate from an APA approved doctorate program in psychology. Then once you do that, of course, while you're in school, you do an internship, you do a practicum, but I had to do more specialized. One of the things that I did was I did a residency in neuropsychology so that I can learn those neuropsychological tests. Some of them are very helpful with diagnosing ADHD, for example. And then the other thing that I did is I did 2 postdocs after that, one with adults and the other one with children. All of it collectively centered around testing and assessment. So some of you who either work with me that are listening or are close friends of mine or other colleagues and associates, now you know why I have so much extensive experience in testing. It's because all of my residency requirements, with the exception of one, because it was therapy. That's why I did an extra postdoc. So I can spend some time learning trauma-focused therapy and stuff like that. Otherwise, my career path has been testing and assessment. So that's why I specialize in it and I'm good at it, okay? So once I got through that, writing your dissertation is a whole different ball game. It's a whole different ball game. No one tells you that although your classes are hard, for example, we had 3 or 4 statistics classes. It may have been 4 semesters, but I don't remember. I'm going to say at least 3, okay? And at least 3. And so it is, once you get into testing like that, you need to take, more stats classes. And so once I finished all that, I still needed to get more experience in therapy because most of you know, psychology goes hand in hand with psychology goes hand in hand with therapy. Okay, hold on one second, guys. I gotta report somebody real quick. Okay. And so while I was doing my dissertation, so while you write your dissertation, you can actually do your practicum and you can apply for your postdoc. So while I was doing that, I started working for a company in Inglewood, Illinois. And so that's south in Chicago, outside the city. It is the city of Chicago, just Inglewood. And so I met a lot of great people in Inglewood, and some are still memorable to me, good and bad. One of the good ones became one of my best friends, and she is a licensed psychologist in Chicago right now. But I'm going to tell you a story that I wrote on my blog that shocked me back in 2009, I believe. Um, when I was working in Inglewood, because it's a story about how to cope with devastating news. So, one of the things that's always memorable to me is when I finished my dissertation. One of the first people that I called to say, hey, I passed my dissertation was a really good friend of mine. And back in 2009, it still shocks me. That's why I pause sometimes. Back in 2009, I moved to Central Illinois and thought about this friend because I lost touch with this person, a male. I lost touch with him and I said, I really need to tell him that I moved because we were such good friends. And he knew my daughter and everything. And he also had 2 children. And so I said, I wonder, he may be wondering where I am and how I'm doing because I haven't talked to him and everything. And so I Googled this guy and was shocked because I found out that he had murdered someone. And I kid you not, I went to my boss at the time and I said, what's the name on this article? And she said it. And I said, did you say? And then his name. And she said, yeah. And I was devastated. Devastated. I could say his name on here because it was all in the news. But I won't do that. You guys can read about it. I was really mad. And I was mad because I found out that not only was an adult murdered by this ex-friend, but also a child. A child. So I was devastated. Devastated. And I was going to write to that person in prison and just say, why? Right? This was someone who introduced me to how to understand some of the gang activity in Chicago. And that's how I learned all about it. So this was an important person for me at the time. So to find out that this person actually murdered 2 people, it was just devastating for me. And so one of the things that I said in my blog is just, why would you do that? Why would you do that? And so, I told the best friend that I was talking about in Chicago that's a licensed psychologist. I actually mentioned it to her, and yeah. So I've met some interesting people in Chicago, and one of the reasons that I talk about this stuff is because I want you to understand the trajectory of my career and how I may have all of this played a part in me meeting nebulous children or children who could see ghosts. And so I met all kinds of celebrities up there, celebrity stylists. A lot of people were just really nice to me and encouraging me to, finish my dissertation. And I did. and I graduated in 2006. So the last thing I needed to do was to apply for my state board approval in Illinois as a licensed psychologist, and I did receive that approval twice. I received it twice. Now, remember, I said my initial goal as a psychologist was not to become licensed as a clinical psychologist at all, because I was going to take that clinical knowledge back into the schools because it's needed. It was needed back then. It's needed now. It's needed now. And so I had to snap back to reality about what I really wanted. If some of you are aware of things that are happening in schools and in psychology, then you know there's a shortage of minority psychologists, especially in the schools. So, but there's also an increase in mental health ailments. And so I decided to go back into the schools once I felt like I had enough experience, in the world of clinical psychology. Back when I started out, mental illness was on the rise. Then when I went to get my doctorate, there was a lot of talk about ADHD and oppositional defiant disorder. So I canceled all plans to go into, private practice. It just wasn't enough for me. So I went back into the schools, and an important lesson that I learned from this is not to be influenced by other people. There were so many people telling me to go into private practice because I was good clinically. I had good clinical background and knowledge. I was good with the kids, everything that comes with people telling you, your colleagues, that you're good at something. And I had to go back and think for myself, what is it that I really want to do with my career? And it definitely wasn't. I think I kept that whole premise of going into private practice just up through, last year or the year before. And then when I just sat back and thought about it, I said, you know what? Working by myself is just not going to make me happy. And they take you through a lot to get your state board license. Especially in approval. And some of you who do not know this, but there's a high percentage of African Americans and other minorities who don't even pass the state board exam. I can go into that heavily, but I'm not going to bore you with it. There's a lot of bias in testing that needs to be fixed. And that's also other state board exams and also the tests that they make us take in order to get into these graduate programs. So I can go on and on about that, but I'm not. So when I decided to go back into the schools, one of the things that I had to understand in Chicago, because I dealt with so many kids in gangs, was the gang activity. And so I didn't just learn it from interacting with the gang members, because I did interact with them, females and males. Back then, I understood everything from hand gestures to colors to the structure, the hierarchy, the drug activity. And I'm being guarded with what I say. And I didn't just learn it from reading. I didn't just learn it from watching these reality shows about gang members. The person that I was talking about from above in this blog actually taught me most of what I knew. From readings to in vivo experience to, it was a lot. And so I tell you this too, to protecting myself on the streets, that was another lesson. And once I was, working with enough kids who were affiliated with gangs, if I was somewhere and they saw me, those kids would walk me to where I needed to go. But I'm big badass. I'm like, I don't need protection. They're like, yeah, you do. So they would walk me to these different places. So I was very well versed back then. And it looks like I'm going to have to get well versed in it again. I found out some news recently that I'm going to be doing in January. And I'm like, Lord, I got to get back into understanding these gangs again in Illinois. And it takes a lot of time and a lot of reading. So I love those kids though. They were very guarded, very protective, um, territorial, as you all know. So that's also my learning in Chicago and Inglewood in particular. And it was fascinating. It's also where I met other nebulous children. And it is where I also, well, this is another site. It was an alternative school. But it made me think about Inglewood because some of the kids that I worked with at the alternative school in Chicago were out of Inglewood. Some of them were, some of them weren't. Some of them were from the West Side. So when I worked at the alternative school, that was heavy because that's when I learned to take kids down. And I don't like doing it, and I don't do it. I'm certified to do it right now to take a kid down, but I don't do it. I'm not 30 anymore. So if you talk about breaking up fights and, taking kids down, I don't do that kind of work anymore. And so, but back then I was like, yes, we get ready to do this. Now I'm like, yeah, I'm not going to do that. So I had at that alternative school, that's where I learned different interventions for kids. So you hear about these things if you're a parent. PBIS, RTI, behavior management. You hear about all that stuff. When I heard about it and learned it, when I worked in the alternative school, and I had the opportunity to get trained in how you manage different gang activity in a school. That's a real problem when you have one school that's full of various gangs. Imagine that for a minute. Rival gangs, by the way. I remember one time, I don't know if I ever told my best friend this story. One time I was sitting working with a kid, and some of the staff came to get me and said they brought two gangs together. And I was thinking to myself, okay. And they said they're going to bring two gangs together and they're going to talk in one room so that what they were doing was de escalation, which is when you try to de escalate the problem or a pending fight before it happens. And so, I'm standing there. Mind you, back then I was about 100 pounds. So I was really tiny, but I was quick. And I will never forget it because it happened so fast. So one of the kids, he didn't try to hurt me. They never tried to hurt me. They definitely had a code about harming women. And so what he was doing, he pushed me. He pushed me hard. I don't know. Some of you watching me can see me. He pushed me hard, and the way that he did it, I actually went out the door. So I was out of the way, and then bam, gang fight. Yeah. And so all of these men came in strong to arm the kids and stuff like that. And of course, I couldn't interfere because these were big teenage boys at that point. And although they didn't want to hurt me, it's kind of like you don't jump. If there's a dog fight, you don't jump and try to break the dogs up unless you're trained to do it, right? Because then the dogs will freaking turn on you and bite you. I know people who've done that. And so that's what it was. So he was pushing me out of the way, and to protect me. And so learning how to de-escalate gang activity is what I was trained to do, along with all of the different interventions, which work very well in a school if the schools will take the time to utilize them. And so here's what's interesting. The one that actually pushed me, the reason that I will never forget this kid is because we had such a good relationship. So we became pretty close in that alternative school. And when my residency requirement was over and I left, I didn't see this kid anymore. And so what I I started to work in Inglewood. So backtrack to Inglewood. And one day I was working with the cutest little boy. He was so cute, and he reminded me of that kid that pushed me, that was at the alternative school. I was like, God, this little boy looks just like him, because I remembered him. And so I had only met that little boy's mother at the time. And so I walked this kid out. The mother said her brother was going to come and pick up this kid. And I walked this kid out the door, and guess who walked in the door? It was the kid from above that pushed me out of the door. This kid was no longer a kid. He was a young man, but a man. And I was fascinated. And come to find out, he was the little boy's uncle, which would explain why he reminded me of him. And so we were talking and everything. And when I first met this kid, the uncle, when I first met the uncle was stealing cars. And I knew he was seeing, spirits, but at the same time, I was like, that's not, I mean, I don't know. At the time, I was thinking it wouldn't make you steal no cars. But anyway, that's what he was doing. And so I just asked him, I said, why are you doing that? Now you're at an alternative school when you could actually be in your regular school. And here's a surprise for you. A lot of the kids that were in the gangs preferred to go to the alternative school. It took them out of their regular schools, out of Chicago public schools. So they actually liked being away from all of the gang activity, if you can believe that one. So putting them in an alternative school, they had to work themselves back into Chicago public schools. A lot of them didn't want to go back. They wanted to stay with us at the alternative school. So when I asked this kid, why are you stealing cars? He said, because I need to get around. I don't have a way to get around. These were poor children whose parents didn't have, resources, for example, cars. So when this kid would steal a car, he would just go drive it to wherever you need to go and just park it. And so I remember I was sitting down with him. I said, you could buy your own car. You're old enough to get a job. And it was like a light bulb went off. And you know what I learned then? Sometimes these kids don't know. If you just talk to them, a simple conversation, and teach them, sometimes that helps them far beyond, putting them in alternative schools and, throwing them in jail, for example. So just talk to them. I can see if they, committed some heinous crime, but, petty theft. I mean, grand theft auto is not petty. That's not what I'm talking about. And I'm talking about petty theft, sometimes talking to these kids, putting them in therapy, doing some of the interventions that the alternative schools would do. Those things were helpful. And so when I saw him with his nephew that day, when he picked his nephew up, I said, oh my God, I still remember him walking in the door to this day. And I said, well, what are you doing now? He had an education. He was in school. He had his own car. He wasn't stealing cars anymore. And he had a job, and he was helping raise his nephew. So that's actually a really good story. So what I took from, and this is just a snapshot of my time in Chicago, just a snapshot. Remember, I spent 8.5 years there. So what I took from a lot of that learning, from relationships to schooling to being a young mother to, alternative schools and hospitals. I was a resident at Stroger Hospital. Cook County Hospital was the name. It's Stroger Hospital now, interacting with police officers and the fire departments. And I have stories about Stroger Hospital too. Being in the ERs. Oh my God. I remember there was a rapist. What part of Chicago was that? A rapist was catching women in alleys. So ladies, one of the things I never do is walk through an alley. Never, ever, ever. Since I had to encounter this rapist in at Stroger Hospital, was grabbing women in the alleys behind those big trash cans, the big blue ones, and raping them. And came to the ER, and I had to be the one to go see him, and I refused. So one of the things that I also learned was I don't have to do what I don't want to do. You don't have to see clients that you don't want to see. And that was one I refused. And to this day, I will not deal with a pedophile or a rapist to this day. To this day. So I've been on burn units. I have, one of my experiences with the burn unit is a mother jumped out of a window with her two daughters, and they were on fire in Chicago. And they were on fire because of domestic violence. She put the husband out. He came back, doused them in gas, and lit a flame. And the way that her mother saved her children, all of this stuff was in the news. The way that this mother saved her children was to grab them and jump out of the window. And I was supposed to deal with the youngest daughter who did survive. As far as I can recall, I don't think her mother or her sister survived that. And I was supposed to tell that daughter about that, but I couldn't do it. So I just didn't. And they didn't make me do that. For one, they undressed her burns in front of me, and I had a baby, a girl at that, and there's just some things that I just can't deal with, and I couldn't see her body burn like that. But let me tell you how resilient she was. That whole time she was smiling. The whole time she was smiling. And I just thought, my goodness. So she was conscious. So she was smiling and she was so happy, just a happy kid. And I couldn't do it. I'm human. I'm not perfect. And there are just some things that I can't do. And from that moment on, although my trainer made me go up to check her mental health status at the time, I rejected my trainer. Then my trainer made me do it to challenge me. And so I did it. And then I went back and said, I did it, but I can't continue. Please don't make me go back up there and see that little girl again. And he didn't. He actually just retired from Stroger Hospital. Dr. Rogers was his name. And so let's see, I dealt with Dr. Rogers. I dealt with my favorite psychiatrist over there, Dr. Watts. Oh, I love Dr. Watts to this day. And so, I've been trained by a lot of well-versed, research-based psychologists and psychiatrists in Chicago. One of my favorite people is also the former chair of my department when I was getting my doctorate, Dr. Mitchell. So when I talk to you guys about children who can see ghosts, who I coined the term nebulous children, now you know some of my background. Some of these things help me to be able to help those kids and also other kids, like some of the kids I deal with. But some of the kids I'm going to have to deal with in January are in gangs and have been fighting quite a bit. So when I'm chosen to do certain things, sometimes it's outside of my control. And I don't know why I'm ordained to do all this stuff sometimes, but it makes for good stories for all of you. So when I deal with these kids that can see ghosts, it is challenging. But I've been dealing with it for a long time, and it does happen, and sometimes the kids have been violent as a result of not just their mental health, but also their ability to see ghosts or the ghost commanding them to do things that they don't want to do. And sometimes that actually is mental illness, but you have to have enough experience to be able to differentiate between the two, because that's when it gets hard. You got to know what you're doing and talking about, because you have the life and the mental health of a child in your hands. So when I grew up in psychology back then, I had no idea I was going to deal with all this stuff, And my career in psychology took me to Central Illinois, where I trained again in working with adults. Now, this whole time, I had maintained side jobs as an adjunct professor, so teaching part-time. So I have that part of me as well. So bringing up, undergraduate and graduate psychologists. So it has been such a pleasure to learn in this field and to give it to other people. So that's why I'm sharing with all of you more details about my background, so that when we go on and we talk about, for example, October ghost stories, then you can put the pieces together. For example, twin flames, that I've dealt with, for example, someone that has murdered someone before. Or when I talk about, being at and I didn't talk about this, being at the alternative school and actually having to face the murder of a child. One of the gang members was shot to death in the street. Devastating. Or when I went to Central Illinois and, oh yeah, I'll tell you this before we sound off. When I moved to Central Illinois, the murder I just talked about, losing a student, that wasn't the last time for me. It happened again when I moved to Central Illinois. There was a student who shared with me a plan to end that student's life. And we did everything we could legally, ethically, and just freaking not wanting her to die. She told me her plan, told me what she was going to do. I was pregnant by this time, very pregnant by this time, with my second daughter, and told me the date when it was going to happen, the month, all of that stuff, and how it was going to be done, and reported everything to this student, through suicide prevention, therapy. I mean, parents involved. We did everything for months and months and months. One day I got to work, and some people came to me and told me that she had ended her life. And I cried. And it wasn't just because I was pregnant. I was devastated. Remember, at that time, it wasn't the only student that I had lost to some type of violence, right? And so the exact thing that this student said was going to happen, that's exactly how this student ended her life. And I was devastated. I cried for days and days over that. And you know what? And that experience was not the last time I lost a student. So when I talk about these kids, I get really serious about treating them, because I know the end results if we don't do it properly. And so it does help me to write this stuff out so you guys can read it. And when you ask questions and chime in, it also helps me to remember a lot of these techniques, so that I can use them. For example, I just thought of one to use with gangs, which I have to use coming up, in a couple of weeks. And I thought, oh, shoot, I do know how to do that. So it also helps me. So if you guys have any questions or comments, make sure that you ask me and you chime in. Oh, my best friend just said, you are so needed in your area right now, with a couple of exclamation points. Thank you. Maybe. We'll see what happens. All right, you guys, it's been a pleasure. Keep your questions coming. Keep talking to me. We will talk more about my growth in psychology next week. And I'm actually thinking that there's a part 3 of my growth, which led me to write this blog. So the second part next week deals with how I learned to overcome biases in psychology. So I hope you guys stick around for that. All right, you all have a Merry Christmas if you celebrate Christmas. If you don't, then have a wonderful holiday season. I will talk to you all next week, and take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.